Hey, Dr. Nelson, do you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, great. So how do we do this? I know that you are the session chair. When the panelists come in, we'll allow them in, right?
Correct.
I'm going to go ahead and make you a co-host.
Yeah, so that I can just email them the link so they can get in.
Okay. You're now the co-host.
Great. Now I can invite and then copy invitation link. Now I can just go email them the link.
Okay. All right. So I'm the technical moderator, and if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. We start the session, and then they basically said that we have to end the session at
On time. Yep.
6:30.
Yep. We will
Okay,
end it
great.
on time. I ensure it.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Nelson.
You're welcome. A quick question to my presenters. Do you guys have any slides that you need to present? Because if so, we need to get the tech guy to give you sharing permissions.
Yes, I have a slideshow.
Okay,
I also have slides.
okay.
Dr. Nelson, I'll go ahead and make fellow panelists as also co-hosts. So when they're ready to present, they can present them.
Yeah, I was just sending that to you in the chat.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you. All righty. Good afternoon, everyone. Good evening, depending on where you are. We want to get started right at the time, and we are at 5:15. And so I'll just quickly introduce myself. I'm Dr. Sharice Nelson. I'm an assistant professor at Southern University in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And we have an exciting panel today. I'm grateful for all three of the papers that are going to be presented. I thank you for getting them to me before, so I'd have an opportunity to look at them. Professor Stout, because we have two graduate students, I would like if we could go in reverse order of the program and give our graduate students an opportunity to present, because I think they have two great papers, and that would mean that Mr. Kevin Sparrow from Emory University will be our first presenter. Mr. Seaby, if I'm pronouncing that, or Seabree, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, from the University of Arkansas will be our second presenter, and then Dr. Stout from Oregon State will be our last presenter. So without further ado, you guys will each have 11 minutes. I will type to you in the chat when you have with your 2-minute warning. So with that being said, Mr. Sparrow, take it away.
Can everyone see the screen?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. So thank you everyone for joining me for my presentation entitled Racial or Spatial Voting, How African Americans Balance the Trade-off Between Ideological Congruence and Co-Racial Representation. So the motivation for my project was the large number of progressive victories in the 2018 election. If you can see by the chart, if you look at the jump from 2016 to 2018, it's really a sharp increase. It goes from about 31 to 81. Which is a 50-point increase, which is a 50 candidate increase, which is really interesting. But what's more interesting is how some of these candidates were actually able to win. For example, Ayanna Pressley in Massachusetts 7th Congressional District beat 10-term incumbent Mike Capuano, who had a huge financial war chest and had endorsements from people like Deval Patrick and John Lewis. And many really saw her victory, and other candidates in this election, really the rise in prominence of progressives in the Democratic Party. But this might not be the complete story. For example, Mike Capuano is actually incredibly progressive. He was in favor of sanctuary cities, same-sex marriages, and he opposed the Iraq War. Ayanna Pressley also had a reputation for being somewhat of a moderate when she ran, when she was in the city council, and she even criticized Bernie Sanders during his 2016 electoral campaign. There's also an interesting demographic story in this district as well. Once a district full of European immigrants, now this district is considered majority minority. And if you look at the end of the graph here, you see that currently, when the election took place in 2018, there was almost 60% minorities in this district. So this raises some important questions about descriptive representation and desires for ideological congruence. Why was Pressley able to dominate in her victory? Was it really because of her clear progressive message? Or was it because she was a person of color and Capuano happened to be white? And if this really is the case, then would any person of color have fared well in this type of district as well? So this leads me to my main research question. So in primary elections where party identification is constant, will African-American voters exhibit a desire for descriptive representation, or will they support a more ideological, congruent candidate? And the literature really says that it really depends on the electoral setting. So in the general elections, really the party cue or the party identification is really the driving force for people's vote choice. But there is this interesting interaction where someone can use their party identification of a candidate to find the candidate that is most ideologically congruent with their self. But what's interesting is that this result really doesn't hold for African Americans. So Dunn and Jesse did an interesting study who looked at all different ethnic groups and their spatial voting pattern. And what they found was that whites, Hispanics, and Asians, if their personal identity aligned more with the Democratic Party, then they would support the Democratic candidate. But for African Americans, this wasn't the case. Regardless of their personal ideology, they supported the Democratic Party no matter what. And this really is a puzzle in the African American literature. Despite the growing number of conservatives in the African American community, why is there still this mass support for the Democratic Party. And of course, some argue that it's because of group consciousness. Some say that support for the Democratic Party is really a group norm. But we really see that party ID in the general elections is the most important factor. And we see in primaries, but what about in primaries when they don't have this queue, this party queue to rely on? So Black voters actually rely on source cues, really these politicians who become more important, these co-racial politicians become far more important. But what about this sort of trade-off? What about the trade-off between a co-racial candidate and a candidate that is more ideologically aligned with them? Well, Ken and et al.'s seminal piece, The Supply Side of Congressional Districting, really addresses this in the early 90s. It finds that in these white versus Black elections, the Black candidate always won, regardless of how they presented themselves ideologically. And we see this preference for descriptive representation in majority minority districts because of the empowerment effect. So Bratton et al. Looks at candidate emergence and sort of finds that as the populations of minorities increase, so too do the number of candidates coming out of the district. Fraga looks at voter turnout and finds a similar result as well. So in general, the literature argues that party identification is really the driving force in vote choice, even though there's this interesting interaction. And in primaries, really this racial cue or these source cues are the driving force in vote choice. So I build on top of this literature by introducing the theory of bounding congruence, which basically argues that this desire for descriptive representation in primaries will allow candidates to use their platforms instrumentally. And of course, beyond primary literature, there is this general preference for descriptive representation. You see that it increases voter turnout, increases institutional legitimacy, but I need to make it very clear that this is not an essentialist argument. What voters are actually looking for is mutual representation, where candidates and voters both recognize each other as being part of the same group and working to advance the goal of the same group. And of course, the candidates can't violate any design norms. Like I mentioned, support for the Democratic Party is a norm within that community. So as long as there's not a Black Republican, we really do feel like there's this preference for distributed representation for these Black candidates. So this leads me to my first testable hypothesis. So in Democratic primaries, where party is held constant, but there's one white and one non-white candidate, we expect that the candidate of color will win regardless of how they present themselves ideologically. And really the main mechanism behind this is heightened outgroup bias. So African Americans have a strong interdependence to their racial group because of their historical experience. Of course, they were left out of life for a long time, had to develop their own institutions. They're hindered from economic development in many ways. So advancing the group interest became a rational choice for them. And this, of course, is best summed up in Michael Dawson's Black utility heuristic. Right, so despite the sort of growing diversity in the African American community, it's still rational for them to use the group interest as a proxy for their own, as long as race is still an important factor. And this strong interdependence really fuels this intergroup bias. So Conover argues that the higher the inequalities between the groups, the more intergroup bias there will be. And really these inequalities between whites and Blacks are extremely high. So in 2016, whites had about 10 times as much wealth. African Americans are both objectively treated worse by the police and also perceive that they're treated worse by the police as well. So, minority voters, you can expect that they will have this negative response to a white candidate when faced with a white candidate. So this allows for the strategic candidate behavior, where minority politicians can use their platforms instrumentally. And this is derived from the deracialization literature, which basically argues that when Black candidates were trying to gain support from Black voters, they had to moderate their political ideology. And this is best summed up in Fred Harris's Lincoln and I relationship, where he basically argues that voters give politicians a pass on racial discussion so they can advance to a higher office. And of course, he's talking about presidential elections here, but I do think that this would apply to primaries as well. And I do not expect that this indifference will extend to conservative ideologies. And this is because Black voters call to mind different issues when they think about conservatism. So conservatism is less about limited government, but it's more about family values and religiosity. So, if a Black candidate said they're conservative because they regularly attend church, that wouldn't violate the theory. But if they're a Thomas Sowell type of Republican or conservative and they say that racism has had no effect on the outcome of people's lives or that the free market is indiscriminatory, this candidate would not have any support. So this leads me to my next two hypotheses. The second one is, since voters and candidates engage in a weakened non-dynamic, we expect that the margin of victory will be the same for both candidates and our progressive and moderate vignettes. And the third hypothesis is that I argue that Black voters will respond negatively to the conservative treatment when compared to the progressive and moderate treatment groups. So to test my hypothesis, I will run a survey design. Unfortunately, I'm presenting the pilot data today. We're currently in the middle of running the survey right now, but it is a national African-American sample through Qualtrics. This is really the best source to use because it's more demographically representative of MTurk or Lucid. And I'll have an N of 600 people in my experiment with 3 groups: a conservative group, a moderate group, and a liberal group. So I have about 200 people per group. So how does this manipulation occur? So just to formalize this, I define progressives as in support of a social safety net. Conservatives are more in support of limited government, reliance on free markets, and the moderates are really in favor of this mixed approach between the two. And each candidate is going to take a position on 4 issues: the policing, the Affordable Care Act, the economy, and education. And I selected these issues because the polling really shows that they're really the most relevant issues to African Americans, but they're also salient issues that you'll see on virtually every political campaign. So I was really looking for issues that were in the intersection of those two. So this is how the treatment will be administered. Of course, respondents will be randomly assigned into one of 3 groups. Respondents will be prompted by saying that they're participating in a mock election and be asked to select their preferred candidate. Now, I want to make it very clear, the only thing varying here is the paragraph underneath the Black candidate. So in the conservative group, the Black candidate will be conservative. In the moderate group, the Black candidate will be moderate. In the progressive group, the Black candidate will be progressive. The white candidate stays consistent across all the groups, which will give us a stable comparison. And of course, we need to make sure that the treatment is interpreted as intended, and there aren't any glaring issues between the candidate pictures. So we ran a short pilot on MTurk with about 200 respondents, and this shows the results of how people interpreted the vignettes. As you can see, overwhelmingly, the vignettes were interpreted as we intended them to. This shows the results for the photos. So I showed the respondents both the photos and asked them to rate them on 3 different metrics: age, professionalism, and attractiveness. And generally speaking, they're similar on virtually all the dimensions, especially professionalism and attractiveness. The point values are virtually the same, and the difference here is not statistically significant. For the age, we do see that the difference is significant, but when you interpret the results substantively, they actually put the candidates both in their 30s. So the 2.7 score generally means that they thought the white candidate was in his early 30s, and a score of 3.0 means generally they thought the Black candidate was in his mid-30s. So it's about a 5-year difference. So even though the difference is statistically significant, we're still happy that they put the candidates within 5 years of each other. And of course, we are doing random assignment, so we should have identical treatment and control group in expectation on these unobserved confounders, but adjusting for covariates does improve the precision of our model. So I include a battery of demographic questions, a self-reported ideology question, a linked fate question, and a question that measures their connection to the Black community. Obviously, each of these is going to be analyzed individually, but for time, I don't want to go through each individual model. But essentially, there are a series of OLS regressions, and I'm going to report the robust Huber-White standard errors. But it's essentially dummy variables for each group where I'm able to control them. And then I'll do a series of robustness checks as well. So with and without controls, I'll do a logistic model with those with binary outcome measures, do a randomization inference, corrected standard errors like I just mentioned, and then an F-test for covariate balance. So hopefully we should have the results within this next week. I wish we could have got it done further sooner, so I apologize about that, but hopefully this should be done very soon. But where is this project going in the future? So I'm really interested in how do these bounds apply to other racial groups. So will Latinos and Asians also give a Black representative a pass? Or will Black voters similarly give Latinos or Asian representatives a pass? Or do they view these candidates differently? I'm also interested for the larger project is how do these bounds change in other election settings? So of course, this paper is mostly about the white versus black elections, but what about a black versus black election? That happens a lot in majority minority districts or elections with multiple candidates or elections with multiple or primaries with multiple stages. So I really expect to expand this and look at other areas in the future. So I do want to thank you for sitting through the theory and the research proposal, and I look forward to any questions.
Great. Mr. Sebree, you are up.
Thank you. If I can share this. Okay, is everybody able to see? Okay, sweet. I'm not gonna be able to share it like the full screen because I have notes up here on the side, but as long as you all can see, I think we're good. Okay, yes. So my name is Warrington Sebree. I'm from the University of Arkansas. I'm a master's student here, my second year. I'm getting my master's degree. And so my master's thesis or my project is entitled Crime News and Racial Stereotype Framing. And so just to get into it, just a quick agenda. We're going to go into the motivations, the question, literature review theory, hypothesis design, anticipated findings, and then a conclusion. So just pretty quickly about the motivations. This is nothing that has anything to do with my research actually, but really I've been fascinated with the criminal justice system, the prison industrial complex, pretty much from a very early age, as having a family members that have been gone through the carceral institution and things of the such. You start learning about these things as a Black man, of course, at a very early age as well, and then seeing some of the disparities as learning about these throughout undergrad did impact my motivations to how I wanted to approach the project, essentially. And so this is just me, showing that there are discrepancies, present in the prison system, and it's something that I took to heart and that I felt like I could contribute to with my work. Here again, it's nothing, supposed to be anything substantial. Just all images here about our media, and we all know how important the media is currently. And we've seen some pretty crazy things over the past year through the media, to say the least. And so we know we have a media that has the ability to divide, whether it be partisan or racially, economically, et cetera. And so, even through the emergence of social media and Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, we've seen a very complex tension emerge. And the media has to be one of the stakeholders in the creation of this tension. And so it's resulted in vast spreading of misleading information, uninformed opinions, and blatant lies as well. And so with more media outlets, getting on the market and being out there for people to partake in and view, the efficiency and accessibility of today's news media makes seeing your own facts or alternative sources in sort of in a way taboo. You want to see the things that you want to see, that you agree with, and you don't want to see the things that you don't. And so amid this controversy, mass media's emergence as a primary source to receive information about politics or culture or race or economics, it requires that the accuracy of what's being presented be called into question. And so what do I mean by this? So whenever I'm thinking of the criminal justice system or crime and things like that, we have to keep it real. We have a racist criminal justice system here in the United States. And the information in the media, or at least the information that people are consuming as matters of fact, it must be called into question as corrupt systems produce corrupt outcomes. We see the results. And so as you can see, the Clark experiment that some of you may be familiar with, of where the girl was asked which doll was a good doll and which doll was a bad doll. Whenever they asked about the bad doll, they pointed to the black doll. Or Peter Griffin, it's supposed to be funny, but there's just a joke that can say, is he okay because he's below the line or above the line? And so we see these images perpetuated and seeing the black people as violent, as bad, as criminal. And of course, these are objectifying ideologies that were in place long before any of us were here, and sort of a part of a separate conversation. But in terms of my research, I'm basically trying to also hold the media accountable as well in the perpetuation of some of these racial stereotypes. And so we get to sort of analyzing the media and the technological advances through time that have made news outlets increasingly accessible to the masses. And the vast amounts of information that is available to society raises concerns about media's outlets' commitment to accurately representing narratives that parallel the real world. And so I felt that it was important to follow this chain of how television has been studied in relation to reality. And largely, the earliest studies of mass media have focused on a holistic analysis of the content that was aired in entertainment media. And so it was largely fictional programs. And so as this scholarship progressed, scholars shifted their focus to interpreting how these programs rendered symbolic effects on certain values in society. And we saw studies that came out that showed the fundamental measure to which television can be, compared to reality is the commercial context that is symptomatic to a capital-driven society. And so, in other words, media producing a product that they want people to give all of their attention to, essentially. And so we move into media that, or particularly visual media, with the invention rather of the television that tries to analyze television content in relation to reality. And then there's Dominick's reflective theory of broadcasting, which poses that television is a mirror of reality. And then we see, as we get to looking at the ways crime is presented in fictional television, entertainment television, and then also the news, television criminals rarely resemble, scholars find, that they rarely resemble their real life counterparts. And racial groups are inaccurately tied to certain crimes that they are not statistically associated with. And so there's a study by Shelley and Ashkins, where they looked at police reports of different areas and they found that outside of one of their areas that they looked at the police data, the other results showed that respondents' fear minimally correlated with the most frequent crimes logged by the police. And so what we see is that the news media, and there's been scholars that have looked at this as well, they have the ability to shape public consciousness regarding what is urgent or threatening in their communities. And so the results showed that in these entertainment programs, that there were overrepresentations of African Americans, where they were twice as likely to be reported as perpetrators of crime, while white people or white characters or in the films were tended to be overrepresented as victims and offenders, and also police officers. And so as more media has become available, we move to the selectivity issue. And so media selectivity emerging from broadcast television, or since the evolution of broadcast television, there have been certain media companies or our local channels, ABC and CBS, right, that basically have sort of grown, as we can see, or what I'll say is that there are more outlets now available, and information is now more widely available, more so than ever. And these programs have expanded to a seemingly infinite amount. And so as a result, media outlets are now in simultaneous competition or competing for consumers' viewership. And so as such, scholarship has trended towards identifying how media producers alter their messages for consumers to self-select from. And so again, we like what we agree with, and then we get on the TV and start yelling at Fox News or whatever, or get on Facebook comments and arguments with our old classmates until we just block them or ignore it. And that's not to say that we have to be apt to all sources of information, but recognizing this, scholarship should be shifted to delineating the delicate balance between audiences allowing their political ideologies to drive the media or the media they choose to consume, and media spurring this process themselves. And that is to say, even though there is ideologically slanted news that can lead viewers to being biased in the information that they elect to watch, these tendencies don't have an impact or have a minimal impact on the factual record of crimes committed and the way that the station should report the facts. So essentially, this analysis or my project, I'm not really concerned or considering the political media as a explicit category for provoking stereotypes, but I'm acknowledging it and saying that as the state of media currently makes political information basically unavoidable, These forces are a potential variable in viewers' interpretation of news information. So that leads me to my research question. In what ways do racially charged phenomena presented in the news media with negative connotations, such as crime, cause underlying racial prejudices and stereotypes to become externally explicit? So we move on to some of the, where I'm sort of trying to locate myself within the theory, and looking at how stereotypes are understood. We understand stereotypes as good or bad in relation to what is being said. I'm sorry, I'm going to keep moving. I saw that at the time. But essentially, I'm combining three theories: learning theory, association theory, and reinforcement theory. Learning, taking our everyday experiences and recording it, and then association, triggering these things that we learn, and then reinforcing, making connections, and being rewarded to make other connections when there's a result as punishment or negative feeling associated to your identity. And then framing as well, what the media does in a way to present, information or shift thinking about an issue. And so I combined the three theories: learning, association, reinforcement, into my larger theory, which would be, I call stereotype trigger theory, which tries to put them in a chain to kind of explain how they behave together, how at least I'm interpreting how they behave. So it leads me to my hypothesis. In a comparison of individuals, crime news is a catalyst for evoking racial stereotypes that, depending on the race of a criminal, influences attitudes about the assailant's criminality, sentencing, and prison reform policy. And so I'm doing a convenient sample, around 230 participants so far. My survey is still live, actually, in Qualtrics. And I'm doing 4 randomized treatments and then post-treatment questions. And so here's my first treatment. These are randomized. And so I go through three different crimes: robbery, armed robbery, an embezzlement case, and a drug paraphernalia charge. And I tried to do that intentionally, to do like a violent crime, something to do with drugs, and then maybe like a non-violent crime or white collar crime. And essentially they're all the same fact-wise. It'll just say, like, consider in another city, a case in another city where a Black man was arrested for robbery, and you'll either get Black or white. And so it's randomized. And then you get the same questions, these same 3 questions following. One other thing about the second treatment is the drug question. I changed the sentencing, so it's less than, or to sort of match the actual sentencing policies of some drugs, of a drug charge. And so here's the embezzlement case as well. I'm trying to get through this. And then I have some policy questions too. This asks about white prisoners to adjust with furlough programs, but it also will be random, so you would get Black as well. And after I ask the treatment questions, I go through the demographic information, political ideology questions about media consumption, preferences in the media, questions about diversity of their media, stereotype scales, feeling thermometers, etc. And I do this intentionally because I think sometimes asking questions about race before treatment can sort of get people to put their guard up. And so I kind of wanted to get their first initial response. And by the way, this research comes from Hurwitz and Peffley, I believe, who they did a study similar. I modeled their study after this, but it was around 1997, 2002. And so I think this information, or this sort of experiment, is largely outdated and could provide some interesting findings for the current day. Anticipated findings, because I'm sorry, am I done?
Go ahead. We'll let you finish.
Okay, thank you so much. So yeah, anticipated findings: conservative news viewers will be more likely to assign guilt, apply harsher sentences, and disapprove of prison reform policy. And including Black in the survey questions will result in more negative answers from white participants. In conclusions, there are some limitations of course sampling. What I was able to gather, didn't really have any funding for this as well. Theory, I am sort of putting these 3 theories together that are sort of existing outside the field. Visually, I think that putting a picture in front of people could influence this. And then moderate and liberal viewers, I think it's pretty difficult to predict how they will behave in the situation. And so implications, more news analysis, social media definitely has an impact here. A lot of people are starting to get more information from social media than cable news. And then agents of influencing political partisanship. If we move from being able to say that, well, news media is able to influence people applying racial stereotypes, well, are they also influencing political partisanship? So that's just very quick implications that I came up with. And I thank you all for listening to me and being here today. It's unfortunate that we're not able to be together. I've always enjoyed NCOPES, and so I appreciate the discussion that we'll have and for the time.
Excellent job. Professor Stout, you are up next.
All right. My PowerPoint is to the side here. And my PowerPoint is coming up as well. Look okay? Oh, perfect. Thank you so much.
Yep, we can see you.
Awesome. Thank you. So I am going to present some research that I'm doing with a couple of colleagues at Oberlin University and also Wellesley College, which focuses on a different type of race-based attack than we've seen in the past. So Tali Mendelberg and others have pointed out that it's not uncommon for candidates, particularly conservative candidates, to paint their liberal or democratic opponents as being racially liberal in hopes of attracting conservative white voters or racially conservative white voters to support them. In recent years, we've kind of seen a twist on these type of race-based appeals. Instead of painting Democratic candidates as being too racially liberal, there are several advertisements which try to persuade African Americans not to vote for Democratic left-wing candidates because they're too conservative or have supported racially conservative policies in the past. Here I show two pictures, both from the Trump campaign from 2020 and 2016. In 2020, the first is from an ad with Janelle and Kelvin King, two African-American supporters of Donald Trump. And it reminds viewers of Joe Biden's support for the 1994 crime bill, in which hundreds and thousands of African Americans, at least according to this ad, were put in jail for minor offenses. In 2016, Donald Trump ran a similar advertisement, this time tagging Hillary Clinton. And the title of this advertisement was called Super Predators. And here it points out Hillary Clinton's statement on African American youth, even though African American youth was implied rather than explicit. They are often the kinds of kids that they are called super predators, no conscience, no empathy. And it doesn't stop just looking at white candidates. African American candidates also face these similar attacks. We saw Kamala Harris's previous experience as a prosecutor was criticized, and Val Deming's connection to the police department was also criticized, and then Cory Booker's deracialized campaign also was criticized. So what we're seeing is a rise in race-based attacks in which candidates are portrayed as being more racially conservative than they may otherwise be, or reminding voters of past support for racially regressive policies. And so it raises the question, are African Americans less supportive of candidates when they are attacked because of their support for racially regressive legislation, or when they're painted as being racially conservative? And second, can candidates do anything to combat these forms of negative attacks? As my colleagues on this panel pointed out, African Americans do pay attention to candidates' racial position, particularly when it comes to racial inequality. And candidates who are seen as being racially conservative generally receive less support from African American voters. This is particularly true on policies which are personal. And so a lot of people, and Mr. Seabury pointed this out, know a lot of African Americans know family members or friends who were arrested for petty drug crimes in the past. And so any connection to policies that support harsher criminal penalties will probably turn off African American voters at a disproportionate rate. So I expect, for both political reasons and personal reasons, these type of attacks are going to be effective in diminishing African American vote choice. And so the question is then, can candidates do anything about that? And so I propose two strategies which may be effective in combating these type of attacks. We know there's a lot of research that shows that when candidates engage in progressive racial outreach, when they champion issues which address racial inequality or speak about their care or empathy for the Black community, these candidates generally enjoy higher levels of success. So candidates who have a previous record of racial conservatism may be able to minimize or mitigate this a little bit by demonstrating that in the future they're going to do things differently and they're going to address issues of concern to African American voters. The second strategy would be apologizing, right? And so there's a lot of research that shows apologizing can be effective because it shows some semblance of accountability. And so rather than saying the policies of the past were the policies of the past, I'm going to do things differently in the future, recognizing that that was a mistake and letting people know that that was a mistake can be effective in altering opinions. And then finally, I kind of expect a combination of these factors to go hand in hand. So candidates who both engage in progressive racial outreach and apologize should be the most effective in changing people's minds. Candidates who engage in progressive racial outreach without apologizing for their past support may not be seen as dedicated to actually enacting that policy. It may just come up as being perceived as empty promises. And candidates who apologize without demonstrating their interest in advancing Black policies which help the Black community those apologies may not be seen as genuine, more expedient to overcome these attacks. And so I expect the combination of these factors are going to be the most effective in combating these new forms of race-based attacks. And so I have two hypotheses. The first is Black and white candidates who are criticized for supporting racially conservative policy in the past will lose Black support. And the second is candidates who demonstrate support for future progressive racial policies and apologize for previous support for racially regressive policies will be the best able to mitigate these attacks. So I test my hypothesis using a nationally representative sample of African Americans collected by Lucid and a separate sample of 500 white respondents also collected by Lucid. And in this survey, I ran a two-stage experiment. And I have a graph to kind of summarize that. At first, individuals are asked about their levels of support for a particular candidate who is either, here's Terry Harper, and he is this party and this race. How likely are you to support this kind of candidate if he were to run for president in 2020? This survey was run in 2019. And then the second group got a statement that said, this is Terry Harper. Terry Harper is African-American or white. And then shown a page where the candidate is advocating for racially progressive issues, including criminal justice reform, voting rights, and a pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants. So that was the first part. And after that, we asked individuals, how likely are you to vote for this candidate if they were the Democratic Party's nominee in 2020? At the end of the survey, asking several questions about the candidate, we then showed a statement which said that Terry Harper, the candidate you just read about, has been criticized for his support for a racially regressive crime bill, which led to the incarceration of a high number of Black and brown people. How likely you support this candidate now? And so that would be one treatment. And then the second treatment was the same information about his support for racially regressive policies. And it ends with an apology from the candidate saying it was he in this case. He apologized for his support for these policies, and he vows to make things better in the future. And so we have kind of a 2x2 experiment. Were you given a candidate who had no issues tied to them or was supportive of racially progressive policies? And then were you given a candidate who was associated with a racially progressive policy but didn't apologize, and then someone who did apologize? So we have 4 treatments: a non-racial and the crime bill with no apology, racial and the crime bill with no apology, non-racial with the crime bill with an apology, and racial with the crime bill with an apology. To complicate this even further, we ran it separately for Black and white candidates. So I'll talk about the effectiveness of these different strategies for Black and white candidates. And so what we ultimately found is, yeah, candidates who are tied to racially regressive policies lose a significant amount of support, over 1 point on a 7-point scale after. So this is, we do a dependent sample t-test. So we have the support before this information is given, and then the support after this information is given. And on average, support for candidates who are tied to racially conservative policies drops by about over 1 point in our baseline candidate for both the Black candidate and the white candidate. For African Americans, though, when a candidate apologizes and says that they're going to fight for a racially progressive agenda, there's no significant loss in support, even when they're tied to a regressive racial policy. And so candidates who have passed in which they supported policies which disproportionately hurt African Americans didn't lose support when they apologized, recognized their mistake, and then said they're going to fight to make things different in the future. So this was the only one that was effective. An apology alone did weaken the effect for African-American candidates. So African-American candidates who apologized but didn't put forth a racially progressive apology lost or mitigated some of the damage of the racially regressive of being associated with the racially regressive policy, but it didn't move it to the point of statistical insignificance. For white respondents, something different happened. Racially conservative attacks were only effective when the candidate either apologized or discussed racially progressive issues, and that was only for white candidates. What we think is going on here is that when candidates say they're racially progressive, but then are tied to a racially regressive policy, then they're seen as kind of not being genuine amongst whites, and this leads to a backlash. And the same thing we think is true for lack of apologizing. I guess I want to make one more quick point here, is that we find the same effect of the combination of racially progressive agenda and apology leading to no significant difference. This is true for both the Black candidates and for the white candidates. So in conclusion, the new style of racial attacks are probably going to grow as a strategy in the future amongst politicians, particularly with long records in high-profile elected office. And I think this is going to be particularly true for candidates from underrepresented groups, in part because a long time the prescription for these candidates to succeed was to run a deracialized campaign, and in fact, present yourself as racially conservative to attract the support of whites. As those candidates run for higher level elected office, they're going to have policies in which they supported in the past, which are going to be incongruent with the political moment that we're in now. And so how candidates respond matters in shaping the efficacy of the attacks. A genuine remorse and a promise for doing things better in the future are generally most effective. In the future, we'd like to look at different types of strategies that candidates may take in responding to this. We'd also like to look at the effect amongst women of color. And then finally, we'd like to look at whether or not Republican candidates face the same penalty as the Democratic candidates we found in this in our study. So thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much.
Well, I thank each of our presenters for their papers. And so I want to take a few minutes I have some prepared comments because you guys did give me your papers in ahead of time. Professor Stout, you are still sharing your screen. So we're just looking at a black screen. So if you could just stop sharing, that's perfect. And so I want to start out with Kevin's paper. So Kevin, to shamelessly plug an article that of mine and my co-authors that was just published in PGI, I put it in the chat here. It's about the idea of insulated Blackness. And I think what you are looking at about this congruency piece, I think in many ways nods to these intra-group fights that happen oftentimes in Black communities, right? And you are highlighting this in a different way. And I'm extremely appreciative of this because I'm tired of research looking at us in a monolith and looking at us in a very, very narrow way. And so I'm very excited about this research because I think it'll provide more breadth as to what are the consequences or what are the trade-offs Blacks are willing to make. And I think your paper does a good job with that. The other thing that I think is extremely important here that you kind of tease out in the paper, and I would encourage you to do more, is this idea, especially because I've written a manuscript on the Congressional Black Caucus. As Black representation at the federal level grows, what does this then mean for districts that are swing districts and not minority majority districts, being that the Congressional Black Caucus is growing, but they are growing because they are winning seats in swing districts, right? So what does this congruency have to do within the viability of Black representation overall? And then the last thing that I think, I'm sorry, that's Kevin, that is Seabury's paper. And then the last thing that I want to speak to yours was that I felt like your methods were very clear. What I would encourage you to do in the paper is charts. Present, I think that you've done a good job in the paper so far. but if you are to present, because I don't think the math is that complex. However, if you present it in clear charts like you did today, is showing this precipitous drop, I think that will then help the non, technical quantitative math person. For me, it made great sense. But that is one thing that I know that when we published, that what we were consistently hounded about was how to present the data in such a way that, anyone that has enough breadth and knowledge of reading the article can then consume the formulas that you are using. So that's to you. Sibri, I'm very excited about what you are doing, and I'm excited about the approach that you are taking. The one clarifying question I have is that this survey that you're giving is with college students at the University of Arkansas, correct?
Yes, ma'am. I'm collecting a convenient sample.
Okay. And so the question I do have for you, right, is because of the nature and where you are by being at the University of Arkansas, this ideological leaning that's going to play a part in your sample, right? This idea that the university, politics is space and place, right? And we know that in Southern states, we tend to see people that are more conservative, regardless of their race, right? White or Black. And so there's just this conservative tinge because of the Bible Belt. And so just, I think that's another limitation that's presented in the research that I think that you should, I don't think you need to change anything in your methodology and what you're doing. I just think that you need to acknowledge that, because I think some people will say, well, this criminality element has everything to do with ideology or political ideology. And this political ideology here in this particular region tends to be this particular way, right? And so I don't think there's anything wrong with the project. I think it's excellent. I love what you're doing. I would just suggest that you discuss that in your limitations, right? Like, I'm a grad student, right? And so I've done the survey where I had participants. And because of that, right? Like, there's nothing wrong with that. But because of that, I understand that the political ideology of this area may swing a certain way, and to encourage that, right, and to really draw that out, I would encourage you just to pull some demographics of where most of the students that attend the University of Arkansas are coming from, right? Because that'll help to strengthen your argument with math, right, with numbers, without I think going back and forth with people as to why that's necessary, because I think that provides great context for this idea of criminality. And the last piece I'll say on that is because I'm originally from California, right? What we see to be crime and what we think about crime is extremely different, right, than people in the South. And I remember moving to Alabama and getting a bench warrant for a speeding ticket, and they arrested me. And I'm like, I'm from California. We don't arrest people for no speeding tickets. I mean, it's just, we don't have the capacity to arrest people over speeding tickets, right? And so what crime means is very different from a region to a region. And I think that's why that piece needs to be there. And then Professor Stout, I very much enjoyed your paper as well. Again, I just really appreciative of all of you guys providing your paper so that I could give this feedback. The only question that I had to you was your latter point about the inverse that you're seeing amongst whites. And again, the ideology is what's pulling at me here again, right? Because my co-author on the piece that I've placed in there he has some theory that talks about ascriptional racism, right? The fact that white folks don't really understand that they're as racist as they are, right? Because of the fact that they'll champion pro-remedial policies, that they'll say all of the right things, right? And so that's the only thing I think that keeps coming to mind with me about your paper, is this idea of are the white participants really understanding what they are saying in this inverse that you are presenting? And I don't really know how to solve that for you, or even have any suggestions. And I'll open that up to the panel for them to provide some. But that, I think, was the nagging question for me the entire time while you were presenting, and then also while I was reading the paper. So I'll give the panelists an opportunity to respond, and then if they would like to, and then after that, I'll open it up for questions.
I guess I can begin since you gave my responses. First, thank you for the paper. I've already downloaded the PDF, so I'll definitely take a look at that once we're finished with this. To your point, about how this really applies to the swing districts. And I think that's an incredibly interesting question, something that I really need to dig into a little bit more. I've already started building a data set of all of the African-American majority Black representatives that are actually in white districts. So to see how voter turnout increases in those, and sort of the expectation might be something that we saw in Georgia, where you see, yeah, this is a traditionally Republican district, but once we see that we have a chance, or it's actually close, with people like Stacey Abrams that come out, we can actually see the voter turnout increase. The only thing that I would say is that it might be a little bit different in the model that I'm presenting, is because that's a two-stage election. So there's going to be the primary election, and then there's going to be a more competitive general election. So we might see voters engage in strategic voting. They might not sincerely vote for their preferred candidate during the primary. They're going to vote for the candidate they think is going to win in the general election. So that's an incredibly interesting question. It's very complicated. So I'd be interested to run some ideas by you, and as we're working through the model and sort of talk about that. But it's a very interesting question that I want to definitely use.
I guess it was me next. No, I really just appreciate the feedback as well. And one of the things that I'm glad you really brought that up, because a unique part of the University of Arkansas is we have programs that have that are able to give tuition waivers to bordering states, and a large amount of our undergraduate population for sure is from Texas. We give them basically free tuition if they get a certain ACT and GPA. So that's something that I definitely needed to take into account, that I didn't even think about in terms of geography, in terms of, you know, geography influencing your perception of crime. That's a great point, and I just appreciate that. And yeah, this is for my thesis, and so I appreciate any feedback that anybody could give.
Yeah, thanks so much, Professor Nelson. It's the thing that I really didn't know the answer to, or none of us knew the answer to. So we're like, all right, let's just throw something in. But I think your point is really good, and something we have to think more about. The hard thing is our sample of whites, while slightly larger than our sample for blacks, is not as, if you break it down by party and ideology, then you get much smaller samples. It's hard to really parse that out. But I think that's something we need to think more about. And as we do more work in this area, I think we'll have to get larger samples and really start to disaggregate whites to really kind of figure out what's going on. And the idea of ascriptional racism is one that I'm certainly going to look into. So I really appreciate that.
Great. And so now we'll just open it up for question or comments. You can just go ahead to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Can I ask a question for Kevin?
Absolutely.
Sure.
Hey, Kevin, I thought your project seems really fascinating to me, and maybe this is more of a suggestion than a question, but maybe I'm curious to know what you think. It looks like if I'm understanding you correctly, you have 4 different policy, or 4 or 5 different policies, like policing, ACA, economy. Then you have progressive or conservative or moderate on those different policies. And so one of the things I think would be a cool thing to look at would be just looking at, and you're probably doing this already, but just across policies, because it'd be interesting if there was a racialized policy. So policing is generally, at least implicitly, racialized, and something like I won't say the ACA because that's not a good example, like the economy is not. And so I would be interested to see if African Americans respond more to racially progressive on racial policies, and then it wouldn't matter so much on the non-racial policies. And I guess I'm curious to know what you think.
No, that's
So before, and this is not to cut Kevin off, but Professor Stout, this is exactly why I sent Kevin our paper, right? This is exactly the reason why I sent that, because in the paper, what we look at and what we argue, it's a theory that I created, and then my co-author Tim, who's a beast with the math, goes to prove this, right? It's this idea that the least times you've been discriminated against as a subscribed Black person, as a self-identified Black person, the least likely you are then to see need for remedial policy. Well, then that's going to affect how committed you are to the congruency of the ideology of these candidates, right? That has a direct effect on that, which is why, I mean, not to self-aggrandize here, but that was why I put the paper in the chat for him, because I think he will be able to answer that question directly even with what he's doing, just by using what we've done in 16, and we've used the data set, we used the ANES to show this in 16, where we isolate just the Black sample. We look at the question of, because you're self-identifying, right? You're self-identifying, and then you are reporting on how much discrimination you feel like you've experienced over the breadth of your life to that point. And then we go back in and look at all of the other pro-remedial policy questions that they ask and see if there is a correlation between the two, and there's a direct correlation. And so I think, again, not to, again, cut you off, and Kevin, absolutely leave it open for you to respond, but I think that that's why, you know, I think he'll be able to answer that question just by using the article, and he can move on to what I think his research is really, really looking at, is this congruency and the need for it, and how strong it really needs to be, depending on who the candidate is and where the candidate is in the race at that particular time. If I'm not wrong, Kevin, I think that's what you are looking at.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a great point. I mean, I wish, you know, it would be nice to be able to break up these ideologies and particularly do something racially specific versus something not racially specific. The reason that we grouped, or the reason I chose to group all of them together, was basically because the literature that I was reading was saying that candidate ideology is relatively stable. So it's going to be very difficult to find a candidate that's in favor of the Affordable Care Act, but then that's also in favor of fully funding public schools. Usually you're going to find a candidate that is conservative on all of these issues, moderate on all of these issues, and progressive on all of these issues. So that's why we grouped them together. It also helped with some other issues like sample size and things like that. But I was trying to help with the external validity of the project by making it as close to the Aaron Presley election as possible, and to sort of have these sort of stable ideological candidates. I'm going to dig into that paper, and hopefully I can sort of tease something out, or maybe sort of try to address that. But that's something that I need to be thinking about more so in my future project, especially when I'm building this data sets, including information like that. And I really look forward to Professor Nelson looking at your paper and digging more. And hopefully we can work more and try to figure out a solution to this.
Other questions?
Yeah, Professor Gillespie also makes the point that it's also important here is that we tested the ideologies for the messages in the pre-test, and they were correct. So that was one of the tables that I showed where the ideologies, like the respondents in the pilot, accurately interpreted the ideologies.
And I think that's why, Kevin, I made the comment to you about making sure that you make, when you do publish this, that these tables are clear, right? Because I think you do an excellent job with these things. And I just think that they have to be illustrated well, right? That's a huge, I think that's a huge lift, right, that we have now as academics in this space, is that if we want people to value the research that we bring to the table, is that how do we find ways to not cut it down, but present it in such a way that it can be absorbed? Because I think what you're really, really looking at here is extremely important for the continuance of Black politics, because there's many people that say, well, Black politics are dead, right? The idea of the need for convergence around race is no longer necessary. And so I think that's why it's really, really important. Any other questions? Well, I've never seen a panel so quiet at NCLEX. I think if we were in the room with one another, it'd have been far more raucous. But I also believe it was because of and I would have allowed you guys to spend a little more time presenting had I known that there were going to be so few questions. But I think that as also because of the excellent ways in which you guys did present it, it did not leave much ambiguity in how you guys presented. And so I'll leave the floor open for you guys to chat or to discuss anything any further. I know that we have the room for another about 15 minutes or so.
So if I could just, open it up. Oh, sorry, if someone has a question, please.
No, I mean, I was gonna say, this is something that my project, I'm in the process of I'm probably going to pull my data probably around the beginning of the week next week. And so maybe if anybody just kind of looking at the project, I know I didn't get to get too deep into the methods of it, but did anybody maybe have any thoughts about maybe what this analysis could look like or any tips? This is the first time I've ever, conducted an experiment before. So maybe are there any thoughts from anybody?
I think my biggest thought about your findings is going to be where you've done this range on drug offenses and time served, right? I think that is going to, I think there's going to be a lot of rich data there that's going to require a good level of unpacking. I'm not a specialist in that area, but I do know of a Black criminologist, and I will definitely send you his way because I think that is where you're going to get a robust analysis, right? Where you're going to see someone believing that this should be worth, and Dr. Baptiste has written information in the chat for you, Kevin. So make sure you definitely take a look at that. But Warrington, like that's the thing that I think where you're going to get a lot of the rich data and a lot of the analysis. And it may even turn out that your data there may get a little noisy, right? And I can foresee it getting noisy again, because all I keep thinking about is the perception of crime, right? And this idea of the perception of crime, and that question to me gets directly to the perception of crime, right? Because again, drawing from my own experiences, I'm from California. If you get caught with a dime bag of marijuana in California, it even in the height of the 90s, it still didn't have the implication that it had when I went to visit my cousins in Texas, or when I came down here to Louisiana to visit my cousins, right? It was, and so I think that's, to me, where looking at the questions that you've asked, looking at your paper, I think that's where you're going to get a lot of rich data that's going to require some level of unraveling.
It looks like I also have a question from Professor Baptiste. Says that Gay et al. Argues for cross-group analysis of linked fate. Have you thought about class, religion, etc. in your analysis? So class, I guess in a way I measured that by income. I know there's other ways to measure that I can do it better, but that's one of the covariates that I included in my analysis. And I don't have a distinct measure of religiosity. That's a fantastic suggestion, which would have been a fantastic idea. I did pick up on religiosity when I asked the question of their connection to the Black community. So if they attended a Black church, then that would be 1 point towards their connection to the Black church. But that's sort of mixed in with all of the other measures that are on there. So I have connection to a Black church. I have African-American sorority, attended at HBCU, all these other factors. So unfortunately, I won't be able to tease out the specific religious effect specifically, but I'm just curious if you had anything more about exactly what you were looking for, Professor, or what you would like to sort of see in the analysis. Perfect.
And I just want to say, I see some of my Howard alums in here. Go Bison, Dr. Baptiste, Dr. Ideal. I'm so happy to see you guys. Even if it's just your picture, it's been a long year, and it's great to see you guys. And it's great to be from the Mecca. So I just have to throw that in there really quickly because I see some of my other colleagues here on the panel. But I definitely want to leave it also open for anyone else to ask any other questions. I feel a little bad for rushing you guys through your presentations now that we have all this time at the end, but.
So just something I thought about with the convenient sample, and I could be totally wrong about this, but it seems like if you find anything, you can feel confident in your findings, because the group that you'd be selecting amongst younger people, and I could be wrong again, that is going to be much more accepting. So if you find something, then you can make the argument that my test is actually a conservative test. If this was done in the general public, then you would really find large effects. And just something to, I guess, think about.
But I think that's the beauty of using the homogeneous
Mhm.
effect that he's using, right? Like
Yeah,
by
yeah.
using this homogeneous effect, he's going to be able, right, whatever his data teases out, he will be able to make a strong argument for what this data presents because of the use of the homogeneous sample
Mhm.
inside of this kind of hyper localized or I shouldn't say hyper localized, but in this more hyperlized sample, right? Like I think that is, I mean, Professor Stout, I think that's extremely powerful for reproducing this model other places, if that makes
Mhm.
any sense.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah.
Thank you,
Ooh,
Dr. Stout.
yeah, Dr. Gillespie's saying, she says she agrees with Dr. Stout. The randomization isolating a causal effect is most important here. Generalizability limitations notwithstanding. Dr. Gillespie always providing such great insights. Not surprised by her contributions at all. I just want to thank you guys. I know we'll just end up right here, but I just want to thank you guys. Virtual conferences are difficult. They're hard. They're not always the greatest things. I miss all of you guys. I miss, I call NCOPES the Black Academic Family Reunion. And I definitely missed our reunion this year. And so I can't wait to see all of you guys in person next year. But I just want to continue to embrace Kevin and embrace Warrington, to know that NCOPES is really your academic family, and they will be, if you continue on with them or continue participating, it will, there was a pin a couple of years that said because of NCOPES, and I can truly say that I have the career that I have today because of NCOPES. And so I would just continue guys, encourage you guys to stay connected with NCOPES. And I'm so happy we were able to get this virtual conference done so well. So that lets us know that we are prepared for the 21st century and moving forward as an organization. So thank you guys all for attending this panel, and we are going to exit now. And so hopefully I see you guys at the award ceremony in about half an hour. Bye, everyone.
Thanks so much, Dr. Nelson, for your comments. Dr. Nelson, where in California are you from?
Oh, I'm from Oakland.
Oakland. Okay, I'm from LA. I'm always curious to know if there's ever that connection.
Yeah, I'm from Oakland, and three of my four grandparents are from here in the state of Louisiana. So in many ways, this is like coming home. And
Homecoming?
one of my grandmothers was born in Bastrop, Louisiana, which is in northern Louisiana, and she cried. She was like, "Are you sure? Are you sure?" Then I said, "Granny, it's not what it was when you left, right?" But
Yeah.
she was really worried, right? They were, because I'm here in Baton Rouge by myself, meaning,
Yeah.
I don't have any family that's really close. And so they were all concerned. I'm like, they were like, "That's why we left the place." And I'm like, I'm gonna be fine.
Better.
I'm gonna be just fine. So, yep. See you guys later.
Awesome. Bye, everyone.
Bye.